Hello, and a warm welcome to Oxford University, albeit virtually from wherever you are in the world. My name's Adam Smith. I'm the Edward Osborne Professor of US Politics and Political History and the Director of the Rothermere American Institute, Oxford's Centre for the Study of the United States and its place in the world. This is part of our America Decides programme of public events, generously supported by the US Embassy in London. And please go to our website or follow us on Twitter for other events coming up in this series. We're in the midst of an election in the United States, which in many respects is unprecedented. It's not normal to have an incumbent who refuses to assure voters that he will cooperate in a peaceful transfer of power if he loses, while the expansion of mail-in voting as a consequence of the coronavirus raises the prospect of litigation and political shenanigans in a close election that will make Bush v. Gore in 2000 seem decorous. In other respects, however, this is an election which follows similar patterns to other recent contests. As has been the case now for 3 decades, the Republican candidate starts from a position where he seems unlikely to break 50% of the popular vote, but has a structural advantage in the Electoral College. In 2016, Donald Trump put together a narrow path to Electoral College victory through the South and the Midwest, which no previous Republican candidate had followed. And yet the most likely tipping point states this time round, Florida and Pennsylvania in particular, are familiar from recent contests. Well, the purpose of this session today is to take stock of how the race looks right now, with just 3 weeks to go until Election Day. And to do that, we have a very high-powered panel indeed, who I'm very, very pleased to welcome to Oxford and to the RAI. Samara Klar is Professor at the University of Arizona School of Government and Public Policy. She's an expert in how individuals' personal identities and social surroundings influence their political attitudes and behavior. Thomas Edsall is a veteran political journalist. After many years covering national politics for the Washington Post, he's now best known for his weekly column in the New York Times, in which he frequently draws on the best political science research to analyze political trends. And Dave Wasserman is House editor for the nonpartisan Cook Political Report, where he's responsible for analyzing US House races. He's one of America's top election forecasters. We want questions from you in the audience, so please type your question using the Q&A function on your screen, and I'll try to get through as many of those as I can in the hour. We've already had some questions submitted in advance via Twitter, which I'll get to in just a moment. But first, thank you to all 3 of you for participating, and I'd like to begin by asking the panel just to give us their headline assessment of the state of the race right now. Samara, do you want to begin?
Sure, thank you. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this excellent panel. This is a really timely, exciting, and stressful discussion to be having for many of us. So just to give you my view on what we're seeing here, my own research, as you very kindly mentioned, looks at how people's personal identities tend to affect their political views. And one thing that I've noted in my work over the past several years is the disconnect between the ideological extremity expressed by political elites or politicians and the actual relative moderate views of most of the American public. What I'm seeing, especially in my polling of Arizona here, which as many of us have been watching, it's a battleground state in this election. What we see is an electorate that's actually quite dissatisfied with the ideological extremity that is coming out of the Republican Party. I think for that reason, in addition to many others, as I'm sure we'll discuss today, the election is not looking good for President Trump. I think we are focusing a lot this year on battleground states. Perhaps these are some scars from 2016, where there was heavy emphasis on the national polling, and we were a little bit blindsided by a few key states. This year, there's been a lot of focus on states. I think that's a lesson learned from 2016. And what we're seeing in places like Arizona, for example, is a fairly moderate electorate ultimately that is looking for a party with a more middle of the ground approach. And that's what we're seeing in the Democratic Party here in Arizona. So my own polling is suggesting that Biden is doing really quite well here in Arizona. Arizona hasn't elected a Democratic candidate for president since 1996, which may not feel that long ago, but it was actually 24 years ago. I don't want to upset anybody, but it was quite a while ago now. So we are seeing a shift toward Democrats in some states where we haven't previously seen it. Biden's polling very well in Texas. He's polling very well in Georgia. And I think a lot of this does come from a lot of the discontent Americans are showing for the level of vitriol coming out of the Trump administration. So I'm really looking forward to getting more into those data with you today. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks. Tom Edsall.
I agree with a lot of what Samara just said. I was struck reading a recent paper by Ashley Jardina, where she and others studied voters, and she discovered that a lot of that the number of voters who feel a sense of white identity dropped sharply after the 2016 election. And she attributes that to a sense of disgust, basically, with Trump. Now, whether that's going to pan out, this is a very hard election for prognosticators, only because Trump is such a wild card. All the normal predictors right now would point to a Biden victory and the likelihood of a Democratic Senate. But Trump showed in 2016 that he is a very hard person to pin down in polling. The polling has improved since 2016, especially at the state level, where they did not have good demographic adjustments in 2016, and a lot of states were off, whereas the national polling was pretty accurate. We'll see how it goes this time. I'm a gambling man, and if I had to place a bet, it would be on Biden and on a Democratic Senate. But I would not be I wouldn't be spending my winnings yet.
Thank you. Dave Wasserman, headlines situation right now.
Well, thanks very much for having me. Right now, I think Joe Biden is teaching a master class in allowing your opponent's candidacy to self-destruct. One thing we learned in 2016 that we should have known all along is that Donald Trump is a lifelong predator brand. He has never succeeded by being popular himself. He's only succeeded by having an opponent to delegitimize or tear down. And when the attention shifted to Hillary Clinton in 2016, that's when you saw the poll numbers tightened. When Trump stepped in it, you saw Hillary Clinton's lead expand. But by election day, the polling average on 538 on Real Clear Politics showed Clinton up 46 to 42 or 43. What's so different right now is that Joe Biden's net favorability is roughly even, whereas Hillary Clinton's was negative 14 at this point in the cycle. And you can also take a look at the current polling average of 52 to 42 Biden. And what's remarkable about it is not just the size of Biden's lead compared to where Clinton was after the Access Hollywood scandal in 2016. Her lead peaked at only 7 points on 538's polling average, but also the fact that there are half as many third-party and undecided voters at the moment. When you add up 46 and 42, there are 12% in 2016 who were either third-party or undecided heading into election day. So there was a lot of potential for late decision-making and volatility that could benefit one candidate, and that happened to be Trump. This time around, when you add up 52 and 42, there's only 6% remaining. That's third-party or undecided. So that really reduces the potential for late volatility. I cover House races for a living, and I've done it for 13 years. And although it doesn't seem like it would provide an obvious window into the presidential race, I actually get to see more polling on the presidential race than just about anyone, because the polling that parties are conducting in House races also tests the presidential ballot. The pattern that I've seen is that Trump is performing between 5 and 10 points under his 2016 margin across these districts very consistently. There are some very suburban districts where Trump is polling more than 10 points behind his 2016 margins. And there are some heavily Latino districts where Trump is polling closer or even potentially ahead of his 2016 margins. But the net result, as Samara indicated, is that we are seeing places that are very urban and suburban shift away from Trump. And Arizona is certainly a state that is very urbanized, whereas we're seeing rural and more small town parts of the country perhaps remaining a little bit friendlier to Trump, but still Biden is doing extraordinarily well.
Thanks. And that prompts me to bring in a question that Neil Matthews asked on Twitter about the change in the, a question from Julia Mitchell on Twitter about the change in the polling methodology since 2016. Tom Edsall said that, made the point that Trump is a wild card, a hard candidate to pin down. Dave Wasserman, are you confident that, can you talk us through a little bit the changes that that pollsters have made in the way they control for different demographics? Does it lead you to have more confidence in the polling this time than in 2016?
Yeah, I might differ from Tom a little bit here because I'm not sure we can be that much more confident in state level polling this year. In 2018, it was a phenomenal year for Democrats, but polling averages did still overshoot the Democratic margins in places like Florida and the upper Midwest. The polling average going into Florida's Senate and gubernatorial elections in 2018 had Democrats up 3 or 4 points. They ended up losing both those races. And in Wisconsin and Iowa, polling showed in the gubernatorial races that Democrats were doing better than they actually ended up doing. And although state level pollsters are making concerted efforts for the most part to weight their samples by college education, which was the biggest flaw of their polling in 2016, I'm not sure they're always weighting it to the correct weight. Some are weighting simply on college education and not race and college education. And the main crevice in our politics right now is along whites with college degrees versus without.
So the state of the race as you see it, which is nevertheless then, as you outlined at the beginning, looking very good for Biden, is that then not so much because you've got an extra degree of confidence in the polling, but because you see the margins as being big enough that even if there's a polling error, it's the margin is big enough for that to be okay for him?
That's correct. At the moment, we're seeing Biden with a 10-point national lead and around a 7-point lead in most of what we would consider the tipping point states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. The margin's a little bit less in Arizona, but I think Biden might do just as well there. But we've consistently seen about a 3-point gap between the national polls and the tipping point states. And in my opinion, even a 7-point lead would be enough to withstand a typical polling error.
Samara, can I turn to you on this? Because I'm struck by, also bearing in mind something that Dave Wasserman said at the beginning there. He made the point that Biden is now polling above 50%, and whereas Hillary Clinton at this point in the 2016 election cycle was still polling at whatever it was, 45, 46%, but below 50%. So the polls would appear to suggest on the surface that there are simply fewer undecided voters. You've written a book about independent voters. So I wonder if you can talk about who, if there are still, how many undecided, genuinely undecided people who are definitely going to vote, how many of them still are there? And who are these people and where are they?
Sure. Well, the first thing I would want to do is distinguish between independent voters and undecided voters, because those are really not the same group. Most independent voters know very well who they're going to vote for. And honestly, it's probably the party that they've always voted for ever since they first started voting. So most of the time when I talk to independent voters, they'll say, oh, I'm an independent. I would never vote for the Democrats, but I'm an independent. So that's sort of a thing. So they're independents. They would never vote for one of the parties, but they don't socially identify with the party in the way that a lot of Americans do. So they don't hold that strong social identity. And what we've seen recently is that independents are largely individuals who are ideological. They support one of the parties, but they don't want to associate with that party. And frankly, I don't blame them, because coming out of Washington, what we see is a lot of anger, a lot of hostility, a lot of fighting, not a lot of compromise. And we know Jennifer Wolak, professor at Boulder, has a great new book showing that Americans really do value compromise. They really do want it, not just rhetorically, but in practice. So independent voters are largely, I don't want to call them partisans, but they are Americans who prefer a party, who support that party, and who don't really want to associate with that party. Undecideds are a little different. Undecided voters really don't know who to vote for. And they might be independent, but sometimes they're weak Democrats, sometimes they're weak Republicans. And as Dave indicated, we have very few undecideds this year. 2016 was a special year because both candidates were historically disliked. Both Trump and Clinton were really not very liked by either of their parties. The enthusiasm for both of these candidates was really, really low. If it weren't for Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton would have been the least liked candidate ever for president, since we've been asking that question. But Donald Trump was actually more disliked. So he takes that title. This year, we don't see that. The Democratic Party is much more enthusiastic about Joe Biden than they were about Hillary Clinton for a variety of reasons, I'm sure. And not only that, but Donald Trump is a known character now. In 2016, a lot of Democrats opposed Trump, absolutely. They feared a Trump presidency, but nowhere near the extent that we're seeing it today, where we've actually experienced 4 years of Trump. The Democrats know what it's all about, and a lot of Republicans do. I mean, the enthusiasm we're seeing for Trump among Republicans is quite low. So whereas in 2016, we had two candidates where there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm, now we have one that's pretty widely accepted by the Democratic Party, and another that's still fighting for approval from within his own party, let alone undecideds from the other party. So one of the most striking polling data that I've seen recently is when asking, we ask, who are you voting for? The respondent will tell us, and then we'll say, is there any chance you might consider voting for the other candidate? And that is like 1 to 2% of respondents, probably measurement error, to be honest with you, will say, yeah, I would think about it. So we see really low crossover between the candidates people are voting for. People know who these candidates are. They know how to distinguish them. Undecideds are really low. One thing I will say is there are certainly a fair number of people who may not know whether they're going to vote at all. And I would say in states like Arizona, those voters tend to come disproportionately from the Republican Party. So what the Republicans in Arizona need to do is really convince the Republican voters that they should come out and vote. That's the undecided factor. Am I even going to bother voting?
Tom Edsall, I want to put to you a question that I think follows logically on from what Samara's just been saying, that's come from Elizabeth Bomberg, who is watching this. She wants to know about the impact of voter suppression, which takes multiple forms, and perhaps you might want to talk a little bit about that. And I wonder whether you can say something about how you think that might affect voter turnout and in ways that may also contribute to a polling error.
Voter suppression is a mixed bag. In some cases, it's turned out that where Republicans have tried to push restrictions on voting, there has been a reaction among Democrats and sometimes even a stronger turnout. In other cases, it's quite possible that it could be effective. Some of these limitations, like what the governor of Texas wants to do, but he's now got a problem with the courts not permitting him, of having only one drop-off box per county, which really discriminates against big counties, that could be a serious problem. The other big problem for the Democrats in terms of voting this year is that many more Democrats plan to vote by mail than Republicans, that the rejection rate can get as high as 5 or 6% in terms of just minor screw-ups on the way people do their signature, whether they check the right boxes, whether they do all the right procedures. Even in Pennsylvania, there's a requirement that you put in the ballot inside an extra envelope, which can make things just more complex and cumbersome. All that is a potential problem for Democrats. Another point I would make, adding to what Samara was saying, is that there is some evidence with voter registration that very recently the percentage of new registrants among Republican-leaning voters is higher than the new registrants among Democratic-leaning voters. This may be an indication of enthusiasm, and what we haven't really talked about is turnout. If Trump is going to get anywhere, he has to get huge turnout from his supporters, much bigger turnout, because he has really failed to do much cross-party or cross-ideological appeal in his vote. There may be some signs, and it's all these are very tentative signs, that he is succeeding to some extent. When people are threatened, they tend to vote more. And the more Trump is threatened with defeat, the higher the turnout among his loyalists is likely to be. You see this with continuing high turnout levels among Christian evangelical voters, who are a constituency that feels very threatened in contemporary America. So there's some real cautions to be kept in mind here, although the likelihood of a Trump victory still is an outside shot.
Dave Wasserman, can I just ask you about this turnout question? I mean, insofar as it's possible to determine a political strategy from the president, it is evidently a playing to his base strategy. And so presumably what Tom Edsall just said there is right, that if he is going to win, he's going to win by achieving historic levels of turnout among his core supporters. I mean, do you see evidence that that might be a possibility in the right places?
This is going to be an extraordinarily high turnout election across the board. And we're likely looking at between 150 million and 160 million votes cast. We had 137 million or so cast in 2016, which, by the way, contributes to a lot of the logistical problems we're going to see for election administrators and in mail voting and early voting in the weeks ahead. But one thing we really need to keep in mind about that turnout is, yes, there is potential for Trump to really amp up his base versus 2016. He won Michigan by 10,000 votes in 2016, Pennsylvania by 44,000, Wisconsin by 23,000. And between those three states, there were 4.8 million whites without college degrees who were eligible but did not cast ballots in 2016. So there is room for growth for Trump. The problem is that he's not winning those whites without college degrees by nearly enough for turnout alone to offset his problem. And in 2016, he won whites without college degrees 66-29, according to the exit polls. And in the latest average of polls, he's winning them more like 58 to 37, 38. That's a big slide from where he was. And the key has really been women. Joe Biden has managed to win a substantial share of blue-collar women in the upper Midwest, and those are his most valuable supporters at the moment. And one of the reasons could be that 22% of Trump's voters in 2016 were at least leaning pro-choice on the issue of abortion. These tended to be blue-collar women who for years had voted for Democrats like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama because they were not evangelical voters. They were very turned off by the Republican Party, who they saw as the party of Bible thumpers and rich people who wanted to impose their moral values and cut taxes for the wealthy. But Trump had some commonalities with them on trade and immigration. Well, now that the Supreme Court vacancy has turned attention back onto Roe v. Wade and attention back on the Affordable Care Act and protections for pre-existing conditions, the Democratic messaging with these women in the upper Midwest is breaking through to some extent. And so that really robs Trump of the margins that he needs among those voters to be able to win those states.
The gender gap that you mentioned there is quite extraordinary, isn't it? And looking in at American politics from the outside is one of the most notable things. It's a bigger gender gap than we're used to seeing in UK politics, although we have seen gender gaps opening up in similar ways, but not as big as you've got in the United States at the moment. You mentioned abortion, and obviously, as we speak right now, Amy Coney Barrett the hearings are being held in the Senate. How important is the abortion issue as an explainer for that very big gender gap that's opening up? I don't know who wants to take that. Samara, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. One thing I would note, and I'm fascinated to hear Dave's report on how Biden is doing among women. White women almost always, I think always historically, have supported the Republican candidate over the Democratic candidate, and I think that's really surprising to a lot of people outside of the United States who don't really understand the sort of the dynamics of the gender gap here. So the gender gap means that women vote for Democrats at far higher rates than do men. But when we start to break it down by racial group, white women supported Trump just as they've supported every Republican candidate. Now, what could happen this year is white women may actually support the Democratic candidate for the first time, and we haven't seen that before. They don't generally support the Republican candidate by a lot, but it's always about 52, 53% of white women vote for a Republican candidate. Non-white women are overwhelmingly Democrat. So much of the gender gap is actually driven by minority women in the electorate, not necessarily by white women, although there is a small, though they prefer the Democratic candidate compared with white men, absolutely. When it comes to abortion specifically, what I found in some ongoing work is that this is really a strong partisan issue, almost more than it's a gendered issue. So Republican men and Republican women are strongly pro-life. Democratic women and Democratic men are strongly pro-choice. And so this is an issue that I think is going to be particularly important to turn out all Republican voters, not necessarily just women. But we actually see that the gap when it comes to abortion is much more partisan than it is gendered.
Mm-hmm. I would just throw in that healthcare and the coronavirus issues, I think, are as much at play as abortion in the defection among non-college whites, especially non-college white women. And that was really the driving factor in many respects during the 2018 election. And the other is the broader defection of women generally, both college educated and non-college, in the suburbs, which preceded the debate on abortion. But abortion certainly adds, especially with the college educated women, adds another ingredient that further drives these women away from Trump and towards Biden. It's a very the dynamic here is you got a collection of different issues, and the only one that seems to be working for Trump is that there is still the belief that he is good on the economy, as much as the evidence right nowadays might suggest to the contrary. But the salience of the economy has declined in contrast to the importance of the pandemic and the fear of losing healthcare. And that's also what the Amy Coney Barrett issue raises, is that if she would join in and declare Obamacare unconstitutional, it would threaten the continued coverage of people who have disabilities, pre-existing conditions, and it would threaten the millions of people who have kids between the ages of roughly, I think, 18 and 26, who are still covered by their parents' health insurance coverage because of Obamacare. These things are, this goes back to the question of threat driving voters. This threat of losing health care coverage is one that will also drive voters, and it will drive them in a direction towards Biden, no question.
If you were
if I could just
advised,
add something.
so, yes, go on.
Sorry, I mean, if we're, I think that the link between gender issues and the economy is, I mean, the economy is potentially the most gendered issue right now. I saw recent data showing that 1.1 million Americans have lost their jobs, 800,000 of whom have been women. So women are really bearing the brunt of the pandemic and of the economic fallout. Women are the ones who have been fired, who are being furloughed, who have frankly had to quit their jobs because they're at home looking after their kids, who cannot get back into school in person. So I think part of the reason why women might be moving away from the Republican Party, particularly white women who have previously supported the Republican Party, is not necessarily what we think about as traditional gendered issues like reproductive rights, but rather economic issues. Women are losing their jobs, women are losing their income at higher rates than men. So, traditionally, when we think about gendered issues, we tend to think about women as the subject of the policy, but I think the economy right now is one of the most important issues for women and is affecting women even more personally than it's affecting men.
Presumably the disgust factor that you mentioned, Tom Edsall, as a motivator is important. Is that a particularly gendered issue as well? I mean, one would imagine that the style of leadership that Donald Trump exhibits is one that may be, trying to choose my words carefully, that may be more alienating perhaps to women than to men.
I think that's clearly the case. Men like aggression, they're more risk-taking. There are real differences in sort of underlying views that make men more receptive to a guy like Trump, who comes across as a tough guy who's willing to take risks, who will stand up for his people, that's the way he's seen. I don't necessarily agree with that as an assessment of him personally, but that's the way he is seen. Women do place much more emphasis on a person's ability to be compassionate, to empathize, and to take care of others. And so that Trump is sort of an embodiment of the gender spread. He is an intriguing person that way, that he captures this in a very central fashion.
I want to, Dave Wasserman, I want to turn for a moment to the Senate, because as I'm sure many viewers of this event will realize, even if Biden wins the presidency, if the Democrats don't also control the Senate, then a Biden presidency's ability to get anything done will be severely circumscribed. The situation in the Senate is that the Republicans are defending more seats this time round than the Democrats are. Dave Wasserman, do you want to just give us an assessment of the state of the Senate race right now?
Sure. So today, Republicans hold 53 Senate seats and Democrats 47. And if Democrats were to net 3 seats, then they would get to 50-50. And if they're netting 3 seats, then I would bet you that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are also winning. And so Kamala Harris, the VP, would break a tie in favor of Chuck Schumer to be the majority leader. But to be honest, I don't think Democrats could pass much of an agenda through a 50-50 Senate. The reason is the filibuster. And there's one very conservative Democratic senator from West Virginia named Joe Manchin, who has said that he does not want to end the filibuster. There are potentially others who will not vote to end it. And so Democrats, to have a functional governing majority, need more seats than 50, in my opinion. They need to get to 51, 52, or 53. Now, in terms of the math in the Senate at the moment, Democrats are very likely to lose Alabama's Senate seat, which was kind of a lucky special election win against a very flawed opponent in 2017. They essentially start out at 46. I think they're going to pick up Arizona, Colorado, and Maine. Samara, correct me if I'm wrong. But that would get them to 49. Where would the next set of seats come from? Well, the next tier of most vulnerable Republican seats includes Iowa, North Carolina, Montana, South Carolina, and both Senate seats in Georgia. out of those 6, I would say today, Iowa and North Carolina are in the most trouble. North Carolina was looking really bad for Republicans up until last week when the Democrat got caught in a sexting scandal. But those 2 seats could potentially get Democrats to 51. And then after that, South Carolina has been the biggest surprise of the cycle in the Senate. The fact that Lindsey Graham is in a dead heat against Democrat Jamie Harrison. That race is fascinating because Harrison, the Democrat, may not need to get to 50% to win. He's using some of his historic fundraising haul of $86 million to try and prop up the Constitution Party candidate on the ballot, a minor party candidate who he hopes will get 4 or 5% and siphon that away from the Republican Graham. So fascinating races in the Senate.
A specific question from Ann Schofield, who is in Kansas. She wants you to make a comment, Dave Wasserman, on the Kansas Senate race.
Yeah, this race is close in the polls between Barbara Bollier, the Republican turned Democrat physician, and Republican Congressman Roger Marshall. And I am pretty skeptical of Democrats' chances in Kansas, to be honest, even though the polls show it close. For a Democrat to get 50% in a federal race in Kansas is a really big ask. And there's no doubt that Republicans are doing horribly in the Kansas City suburbs, which are increasingly college educated and upscale. But problem is, Kansas as a whole is still quite a Republican state. And the Supreme Court fight does nothing to help Democrats in places like Kansas and Montana, which are states Trump carried by 20 points last time. Trump is likely to carry them by significantly less this time, but it still should be enough to lift the Republicans to victory in those races.
Do you have any comment on whether the revelations of an affair by Cal Cunningham, who's the Democrat challenger in North Carolina, is going to blow his chances of what would otherwise look like a reasonably likely Democrat pickup?
Well, it certainly doesn't blow his chances, but it makes the race potentially more salvageable for the Republican Tom Tillis. And American voters have a higher tolerance than they used to for this kind of behavior. Clearly, President Trump is still very much in the game in North Carolina after paying over $100,000 to a porn star to keep a affair covered up. But look, the way that Cunningham has handled the scandal does nothing to help his cause. And it's still an extraordinarily close race. Of the top battlegrounds, I'd peg North Carolina as the state that I could still see kind of defying the polls and staying in the Republican column just because of the rural and non-college white share of voters there.
Do you, I don't know who wants to take this question. We've got a question from Nancy Roy, who asks about split ticket voting. Is it the case that, is there a scenario in which there's an increase in split ticket voting this time, with Republicans voting for Biden if they're disgusted by Trump, to use the word that Tom Edsall has introduced into the conversation via the academic research, but vote Republican lower down the ticket? Is there any evidence, any reason to think that might happen?
I'm happy to talk about the situation in Arizona. We're actually seeing evidence of potentially the reverse, though. So Biden is polling worse in our state than is Mark Kelly. So as Tom and Dave may have mentioned, Mark Kelly, the Democratic senator candidate for Senate here in Arizona, is polling widely ahead of Martha McSally. It really does appear that he will be victorious, and Arizona will send 2 Democratic senators to Washington for the first time since the 1950s. This is a really big shift here in Arizona. Biden is really neck and neck with Trump. He's been consistently ahead, but only by 1 or 2 percentage points, so nothing outside the margin of error. Maybe that's grown recently, nothing that I've really seen consistently. So this would suggest actually the reverse of what you were suggesting, voters voting for a Republican at the top of the ticket, a Democratic candidate for Senate. And in the polling that we've done here at the University of Arizona, we find that Republicans view the Democrats in our state as significantly more conservative than the Democrats nationally. We also see some evidence that the Republicans in our state are seen as sort of out of step with the national party. So, voters do tend to have different perceptions of parties at the state level and at the federal level, and that's because the campaigns are very different. Mark Kelly here in Arizona is very wisely pursuing a really centrist campaign. He's trying to appeal to moderate voters. Arizonans are really moderate. Democrats and Republicans hold a really mixed sort of selection of policy preferences. So what they're getting is a moderate Democratic candidate at the state level. And, they have various views on Joe Biden, but he's certainly more to the left explicitly than somebody like Mark Kelly. So split ticket voting isn't really as bizarre as it sounds, given that voters are dealing with two very different campaigns, giving very different policy platforms. So if there may very well be in Arizona, I think the odds are pretty high, we may see the state electing the Republican candidate for president and the Democratic candidate for Senate, and that wouldn't be out of the question at all here.
We've got a lot of people asking questions along the lines of what are the chances of us knowing the result of the election on election night itself? That has a question with a lot of strands to it, and I guess the basic answer presumably is if Biden wins by a very large margin, then we are likely to know on election night. Is that right, or is the extent of mail-in ballots, will that mean that even in the case of a fairly comfortable Biden margin in the popular vote, we still aren't likely to know on election night? Tom Edsall, do you want to comment on that?
I think a lot of states are going to be inundated with levels of absentee ballots that they've never seen. And how well they can handle that and how quickly they can handle that will be a real issue. There will be, though, some predictive ability when you still have a lot of votes left to count, and they are presumably all mail-in ballots. We will be able to know more or less how much better Biden does than Trump on mail-ins. And so if you have a undecided situation with X number of absentee ballots still to be counted, you can estimate what the likely outcome is going to be. It certainly will not be official, and it's going to be a chaotic situation. The bigger problem will be, what will Trump do in those circumstances, and will he declare a victory, or will he declare it a false election because of the absentee ballot still outstanding? What kind of doubt will he try to cast on the outcome no matter what? If it looks that way, it looks like the absentees will be this blue shift that will come in late and shift it to Biden in a pretty clear fashion. It's going to be a mess.
I mean, presumably, I don't know whether that was a rhetorical question you asked there, Tom, as presumably the answer to the question of will Trump try to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the election and declare victory is that presumably he will, because that's what he's been setting himself up to do for the last few months. Is there
how much he actually declares victory is one thing, though. His casting doubt there's no doubt that he is doing it already. Whether he will be willing on election night to say, I am the victor, when it's still a lot of outstanding votes are yet to be counted, that's another matter. That takes it a whole step further.
I mean, perhaps part of the picture here will be what happens in Florida. I don't know, David Wasserman, do you want to speak particularly to Florida? If Trump loses Florida, and from what I read, but you'll correct me on this, from what I read, it sounds as if counterintuitively, Florida seems to be likely to be in a better shape to deal with its mail-in ballots than Pennsylvania. If that's true, might it be the case that we get a result in Florida? What's the race looking like in Florida right now?
Yeah, so I work for a network decision desk, in full disclosure, so we are figuring all of this out, and it's going to be an unprecedented situation, no doubt about it. But the irony is that for all of the crap we give Florida for the 2000 hanging Chad situation and the Bush v. Gore recount, it could be one of our best indicators early on election night of what the heck is going on. because Florida has a robust infrastructure for processing and counting its absentee ballots quickly. Florida's counties are permitted to begin processing their absentee and mail ballots 22 days before the election, and they typically release those early voting and mail results when the polls close. And if there's one county in Florida that I'll be watching more closely than any other, it is Sumter County, which is in north central Florida. It's the Villages, which is one of the largest retirement communities in the country. That county has the highest median age of anywhere in the country, 69 years old. And in 2016, 84% of voters in Sumter County cast their ballots in advance of Election Day, compared to the statewide average of 69. So we should have a very clear idea early on election night of whether Joe Biden's progress with 65 plus voters, this so-called grave revolt, is real from the results in that county. If we see the early votes come in and they're 60 to 39 for Trump, that's not good enough for Trump. He won 69% of the vote there in 2016. So he's going to need to win those kinds of places 2-1 to have a chance of winning Florida. And Trump needs to win Florida to win the election. Now, if Trump does win Florida narrowly, and we know that by 9:30 or 10 p.m., we're simply going to have to wait, because Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, they're going to take a long time to count their ballots. And in the cases of Michigan and Wisconsin, their elections are handled for the most part at the municipal level. So there are thousands of township clerks and individual registrars who are counting mail ballots and then taking their time to report results. In Pennsylvania, I'm very fearful of the naked ballot situation that Tom alluded to. It could potentially result in the largest disenfranchisement of any state's election in history because of ballot technicalities with the mail. And then in Arizona, as Samara knows very well, Martha McSally, the Republican, was ahead on election night in 2018, and it was the subsequent weeks of counting that allowed the Democrat, Kyrsten Sinema, to overtake that lead. So we can only imagine the extent to which the president will try and hype up any irregularity, every example of human error in the election administration process, and try and turn it into something that's nefarious when it's really an honest mistake.
Yeah. So can you give us, while I'm still talking to you on this subject, Dave, can you give us a kind of possible timeline for election night, measured in Eastern time, if you like? I mean, at what point in the evening what are the kind of landmark moments? When are they likely to occur, so far as you can tell now?
Yeah, well, I kind of wish we did it like you guys do, where we have every constituency announcing their results, and it's kind of a steady stream. But it's going to be very haphazard over here. We are likely to see North Carolina and Florida report the overwhelming share of their result by, I would say, 9:30 or 10 p.m. Eastern. But we're going to have other states in the north that take a much longer time to count their ballots. And look, every news organization needs to make absolutely clear that there is a massive divide between partisan preferences of voting by mail and voting early in person and voting on election day. Trump has polarized that with his rhetoric. And as a result, according to the most recent Pew Research survey of 10,000 voters, Joe Biden is leading voters casting their ballots by mail 69 to 27%. He's leading among early in-person voters 55 to 40. Trump is leading among election day voters 63 to 31. So in a lot of states, the first results that we get are going to be overwhelmingly skewed in Trump's favor because they'll be the results from polling places. But we're going to see subsequent results as absentee ballots are counted and added to the tallies that are very heavily for Biden. And that polarization makes it very difficult for us to model what's happening on election night.
Thank you. That's very helpful, if not reassuring, from the point of view of the anxiety levels of of viewers. I want to throw in a question here. I don't know who this should go to, maybe to Tom Edsall first of all. It's a question, I guess, is there any sign of what you might call the Lincoln Project effect? So I think probably many viewers of this event will know that the Lincoln Project are a group of, I guess, renegade Republicans who ran former Republican presidential campaigns in various capacities, who've been running these very, very hard-hitting ads. And their stated aim, which is to take down Trump and Trumpism, I guess translates into a strategy of peeling off some small but significant percentage of the Republican vote in enough key places to shift the election. Is that really a thing, or is this just a kind of media hype? I mean, they get a lot of attention on Twitter. Is it actually a real thing which we can see in the electorate? Who wants to take that?
I'm not sure that they're limited. They're not just going after Republican voters. I think they're actually just looking in general at general election voters. How effective they are is I don't know. David might have more data on that. I don't know. They have been very effective, though, in irritating Trump, and he has been known to be very aggravated by the charges that are leveled in these ads, which are very effective. The Lincoln Project is run by largely Republican media consultants who have been expert in past elections, in winning elections for Republicans. And they are a very talented crew. And they have come up with some pretty tough ads. And if anything, they have sort of thrown Trump off his game. And that may be their most important effect. But I would defer to David in terms of actual substantive effect on voter outcomes.
Yeah, in terms of getting inside Trump's head, I think the Lincoln Project has been a smashing success. In terms of moving actual votes, I see it as pretty much a nothing burger. And the reason is that what we know about the remaining persuadables, the voters who are still not firm in their choice, and there aren't very many of them, are that they're pretty low engagement on the political spectrum for a reason. They are not mainlining cable news. They do not watch CNN or MSNBC or Fox. These are people who, when they see either something that is kind of propagandistically pro-Trump, or if they see something that's over the top, virulently anti-Trump, they immediately tune it out. That's not what they're interested in watching. And so a lot of the Lincoln Project's ads in the DC market geared towards reaching Trump are virulently over the top. In swing states, their messaging is still very vehemently anti-Trump, but it is it's a little subtler. It's focused more on his temperament. What we know is that what actually works in persuading these voters to vote for Democrats is bread and butter economic issues. It's education, it's minimum wage, it's attention to jobs. That's what the Biden campaign has done a good job of doing. I'd also say that Michael Bloomberg's money in Florida has been effective in raising the salience of COVID-19 and Trump's lack of response to it. But the Lincoln Project ads that go after Trump for being a bad person, they just fall flat with swing voters.
Samara, can I just come to you? I'm conscious that we're coming towards the end of our time here. We've had a couple of questions about Hispanic votes, the vote in particular, which is obviously of some significance in your own state of Arizona. I wonder if you can just offer a comment on whether, I think one way of formulating this question is, does it even make sense to speak about the Hispanic vote in any kind of singular way? Is there evidence, one person has put it like this, that the Hispanic vote is now so fragmented across various other different cross-cutting divides that it's a harder constituency to read? Do you have any comments on that and how it will play in the election this time?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's very, very few demographic groups that we could ever in good conscience consider to be a monolithic voting bloc. I mean, it doesn't really happen as often as we would like it to be in terms of looking for patterns. So the Latino vote in states like Arizona, where it's very important, even in California, New Mexico, which are clearly more deep blue states, it's not a homogenous vote to be sure. However, I will say that it does lean heavily Democratic. We see about 2/3 of Latino voters who tend to support the Democratic Party. About a third will vote for the Republican Party. So it's a big advantage for the Democrats that in a place like Arizona, the proportion of the electorate who are Latino has grown so rapidly over the last several years. So it's certainly a trend that helps the Democrats. And while, of course, it's not a monolithic voting bloc, I would say it's, quite certainly an advantage to the Democratic Party.
Final question to all of you in turn. Is there anything that you can think of that might happen between now and polling day that might change what otherwise appears to be a fairly settled trajectory of this election? Dave Wasserman?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, the last 2 weeks have felt like 2 years. So we still have more than 3 weeks left until election day. And look, there is potential for another few momentum shifts in the race. The problem, as I see it, is that Biden's lead is much more stable than Hillary Clinton's was in 2016. Yes, it's ebbed around the margins. In a couple months before Trump was hospitalized, we saw his number come up from 40 to 43 or so as he consolidated his base. But we saw Biden's number remain fairly stable in the 50 to 51% range. Now Biden's lead is a bit inflated. I wouldn't be surprised if it came back down to where it's been for a lot of the year, around 7 or 8 points. Look, I think Trump would need to bring Biden's lead nationally down to 4 or 5 points to have a chance of being able to thread the needle in the Electoral College, which certainly there's still a pro-Trump bonus in the Electoral College. But at the moment, he's really not within range of where he would need to be.
Tom Edsall.
The one thing that would come to mind is Biden getting a bad case of COVID and being basically infirm. Let's not hypothesize that he dies, but that he is hospitalized for the last week of the election. I don't know what that would do, but it would certainly, it's the kind of big event that could influence factors. And it would raise the salience of Kamala Harris and how well she would sell to voters as a prospective president would be another matter. I don't know, but I would just throw that out. Be looking for something big.
Samara.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think if 2020 has taught us anything, it's not really the things we can think of. It's all these things that we can't even think of. They're like unthinkable that are probably going to happen. It's been such an incredibly unpredictable year. There's been so many events that have happened that you think would be affecting the election that seem to really have no influence whatsoever. But I will say, I mean, I wish that I wish something else would come up, because that would suggest that the salience of coronavirus would go down. But given how salient this issue is, the public health crisis in the United States is not under control by any stretch of the imagination. Half of school districts are still online. The recession, or the economic fallout, has not been solved. And I think for anything to overtake those issues, things would have to be a little more under control, and it doesn't seem like they will be over the next few weeks. So I think Tom's suggestion is wise in that it's still connected to our ongoing issue. Although I would say that, the more that COVID is in the news, the worse it does for President Trump. But I think that the COVID and economic recession issues are here to stay, unfortunately. Although having now said that, I'm sure something completely unpredictable is going to come up, but that's the way it's been going.
Well, that seems like a very good note for us to end on, since it does sum up so much of all of our experiences of this craziest of years. Samara Klar, Thomas Edsall, Dave Wasserman, thank you very much. This has been a very stimulating and interesting discussion about an issue which I know many people are following in this country and around the world, as well as in the United States, with very close attention indeed. So thank you all, three of you, very much. And thank you to everybody. We've had over 200 people watching this. Thank you very much, wherever you are, for joining us. And please do go to the Rothermere American Institute website and follow us on Twitter. We have other events like this coming up in the next few weeks. So I hope that I will see you all again in a similar event to this in the near future. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. It was great.
Thanks, Adam.